All apologetics seem to suffer from these three problems. The first problem is what I call the epistemological problem. It probably has an official name, but that's what I call it. I have talked about it in a few of my videos, however, I want to lay it out here in detail along with its implications. Epistemology is simply a study of how we know things. There are three possible root sources of knowledge. I exclude communication of any sort because it ultimately relies on one of the three. The first is logic. For example, the law of identity, usually expressed as A equals A, means any object is equal to itself. Or the impossibility of total omnipotence. Can a totally omnipotent being create an object so heavy he can't lift it? That creates a paradox, so that is knowledge based on logic. Then there is empirical evidence. Observations are a good example of this. In science, these two methods are combined. You need empirical data to employ logical reasoning the vast majority of the time. You also need logical reasoning to do anything useful with your empirical data. So these are used together. That's why I think the rationalism versus empiricism debate is completely nonsensical. But I digress. The third and final source is the mind. You can make things up. Entertainers of various sorts do this. So, when we examine a knowledge source, we go right down the line. Is there a sound argument for why it logically has to exist? In the case of gods, the answer is no. It is important to keep in mind that there is a difference between an argument showing something logically must be so, and an argument showing how some presupposed idea may be possible. Now, is there any empirical evidence? In the case of gods, we must again answer in the negative. So by process of elimination, we have determined that the concepts of any and all gods came from the mind. They were made up. Let's now extrapolate the implications of this. If any gods did exist, it would have to be coincidental to the made-up concept. So people invented this idea, and it just happened to be true coincidentally. It also means such a being is hiding its existence from us. These things, coupled with the unfalsifiability, make gods about as impossible as something can be without being an absolute, which is impossible with empiricism, obviously. So, at the very least, we can see that all such God concepts absolutely are made up. So, an apologist may as well be arguing that Darth Vader coincidentally happens to exist. Their argument must necessarily be that this made-up concept exists coincidentally and is unfalsifiable due to either hiding itself or a total inability to interact with our reality. The next problem is presupposition. They came up with this idea after the fact and are going back trying to find reasons to believe it. Frequently, these arguments are premised on things that imply the God, whose existence is the conclusion of the argument. Purpose is a good example of this. Since the God is part of the premise and the conclusion, it is a logical fallacy called begging the question. Even without that, there is always going to be some sort of presupposition due to the aforementioned epistemological problem. The last problem is the argument from ignorance. It's very difficult, if not impossible, to find any argument for gods that does not employ this in some way. This is when a knowledge gap is pointed out. Then the presupposed concept du jour is inserted in that gap. Sometimes the gap in knowledge isn't even a gap anymore. There is nothing surprising about seeing this fallacy. After all, the original God concept has its origin in arguments from ignorance. Any such concept was originally used to explain something unknown to its inventors. Some apologetics have additional problems, but the better arguments have only the ones I mentioned. They all boil down to making excuses after the fact. So that is why apologetics always fail and are an exercise in futility.